So thank you everyone for joining the Missouri Department of Conservation's Wild Webcast on deer management in Missouri. We are here tonight with our guest expert, Jason Isabel, who is the Servant Program Supervisor for the Department of Conservation. So thank you, Jason, and welcome.
Happy to be here.
So tonight we are going to be talking about, of course, deer management in Missouri, and we're going to work through this PowerPoint. All right. Today, Jason.
We'll start with basically going to cover the four primary goals of our deer management plan, which we just revised last year. So we'll start out talking about deer population management. We'll transition into hunting and recreation. We'll include 2025 deer regulation changes within that bullet. Then we'll talk about deer health and disease. Specifically, we'll talk about CWD and hemorrhagic disease. And then lastly, we'll transition into public engagement and partnerships, and then roll that right into our efforts to engage the public about deer management this fall.
All right, so we talk about deer management in Missouri. This goes back quite a ways.
Yeah, so certainly been a partnership with the public going way back to the formation of our agency. You know, it's hard to think about early 1900s. There was, at one point, we were down to less than 500 deer in the entire state of Missouri. So certainly a change in public attitude as the conservation movement started. Our agency formed. Restoration, highly successful to the point where today deer are common throughout the state. It's just been a tremendous success story that's been due to that partnership, and certainly a partnership that's going to be really valuable moving forward as we think about the future of deer management.
So we are working hunters, landowners, just really folks in Missouri who love deer, and we went from what, fewer than 500 about 100 years ago. Where are we today?
We're close to about 1.7 million.
That's quite a bit of growth. I'd say that's a success story. So the importance of deer, we love them, to see them, to hunt them, all of that, but they really are an iconic species with a great amount of importance.
Yeah, and so certainly a very important species to the stakeholders of the state, and certainly the folks tuned in to the webcast understand that. We have almost 500,000 people that enjoy deer hunting in Missouri. Surprises a lot of folks just in terms of the economic impact, but based on the latest survey, over $1.5 billion to the economy each year, supporting over 13,000 jobs. So not only a very ecologically important species, but certainly a very important species to the many citizens that we have in our state.
Yeah, so when we talk about deer management, there are these four aspects of it again.
Yeah, so going through these, we'll start out with deer population management. We'll dive a little bit into that.
All right.
So if you think about deer population management, I wanted to start out just to say that certainly MDC and the public have a shared goal. We want to have a healthy deer herd. We want to have a deer herd that's healthy at a biological level, but certainly at a social level as well. We know we have a diversity of stakeholders, from folks that enjoy deer hunting to agricultural producers, folks that drive our roadways. There's a lot of people that are impacted by deer in one way or the other. And we know based on their interest and how they interact with deer, their perceptions of deer abundance can vary a lot. And so that's really why we use public input to help us determine where our deer population is in relation to how our stakeholders feel about deer numbers. So we rely very heavily on the input that we get from the public.
Right, and you mentioned when we talk social carrying capacity, tell us a little bit more about that. That's not just the number of deer that can be healthy on a landscape, but to minimize that line between conflict. You're saying agriculturally driving your HOSTA.
Yeah, so social carrying capacity is really the level of the population that's satisfying to stakeholders, recognizing that there's going to be a lot of variability there. So we survey tens of thousands of hunters and agricultural producers every year, and we ask them how they feel about deer numbers in the area where they hunt or where they farm if they're a producer. And we use those data sources in addition to the wide range of public contacts to gauge how we're doing in each of the 114 counties, where we are in relation to that social carrying capacity, and then we can use that information to set our hunting regulations to increase numbers, decrease numbers, or keep deer numbers right where they are.
Okay, good to know. And again, public input, critically important to what we do. And we have some current and future challenges.
Yeah, so certainly as we think about deer management with the revision of our management plan last year, as we thought about the challenges that we face now and those in the future, certainly chronic wasting disease, a huge threat to our deer herd that we are working really hard with our partners to slow the spread to protect the herd. And also we've got fewer deer hunters now than we did a decade ago. And we've also seen some shifts in hunter preferences in terms of desires to manage for and harvest older age class bucks, and less of an interest among some of our hunters for harvesting antlerless deer. So definitely some challenges that we're facing now and things that we'll be tackling as we move forward as well.
And you mentioned some changing in hunter preferences and things, so let's delve into more on hunting and recreation.
So in terms of recreational opportunities, obviously we have to manage for a deer population that's at biologically appropriate levels and socially acceptable levels. And deer hunting is obviously the primary tool that we accomplish that by. But our season structures, a lot of our regulations are based on the desires of our hunters, what they've told us on the surveys and what they've told us through the various means of contact that we have with them. And so obviously the number of deer on the landscape impacts the quality of a hunting experience, but the deer seasons and regulations themselves also have an impact. We also recognize that hunter motivations vary a lot too. For some, it's just the idea of getting out into the woods.
Like deer camp,
spending time with friends and family. For others, for a lot of our hunters, obviously provision of food. Venison's a wonderful food. For other hunters, it's the pursuit of mature bucks that drives their motivations. And I would say that these are not mutually exclusive. For a lot of hunters, it's a combination of these. And so we recognize that hunter motivations vary. And so we have the challenge of managing our deer population so that it is biologically and socially acceptable levels, but also recognizing that our hunter desires and motivations vary. And so we can use the survey data that we collect from those tens of thousands of hunters each year to try to develop seasons and regulations that satisfy most of our hunters, while recognizing that we must protect the herd from long-term threats, chronic wasting disease being a huge threat that we'll get into as we progress with the webcast.
And to reiterate, when we change deer regulations, yearly or over time, that's in response to not only the best of the deer herd for what's best for the deer herd, but as you said, also what hunters want. So we're adapting our regulations in part based on what hunters are wanting.
Yes, absolutely.
And speaking of that, we had some regulation changes for this coming season.
Yeah, so we'll go through these pretty quickly. They're in the 2025 fall deer and turkey regulations booklet, but this year we removed the in-state carcass transportation restrictions, and so in their place established carcass disposal regulations. So the previous regulations regulated which parts of deer could come out of the management zone. Did away with those, and the carcass disposal regulations for any hunter in all 114 counties beginning this fall. They can transport deer anywhere in the state, or deer parts anywhere in the state, as long as any unused parts end up either in a landfill or in trash service that ends up in a landfill or left on the harvest property. And that's designed to slow the spread of CWD, reduce the chances of somebody harvesting a positive deer, taking it to a different location in the state and discarding the remains out on the landscape and spreading the disease. So it's a much simpler regulation than the carcass transportation was. So hopefully folks be a little bit more intuitive for folks, and at the end of the day, help us to minimize the impacts of the disease on our deer herd.
Okay, we're going to just go over another minute on that just to make it real clear. Before, if you harvested a deer in a CWD county, you had to dress it, process, do everything within that county. You couldn't move certain parts out of that county, right?
If you shot in the management zone, high-risk parts, which should be the brain, spinal column, only be transported out of the county harvest. So just think of taking the carcass out of the county of harvest. Could only happen if it ended up being delivered to a taxidermist or a meat processor within 48 hours, or the head to a CWD sampling station within 48 hours.
Okay, so we've kind of
eliminated those.
Right, and now you could transport your deer throughout the state. You're not so limited, but again, just reiterate what that is again.
Yep. So now it's not just, the regulations are not just in the management zone. They're for any county. Hunter could harvest a deer in any county, transport it to its final destination, as long as those unused parts are either disposed of in the trash that end up in the landfill or left on the harvest property. So provide some more flexibility for hunters, a little bit less burdensome on them. And should really help us in our overall desire to slow the spread of the disease.
Okay, and the focus is still on making sure that those high-risk parts are disposed of properly. That's really where the focus is now.
It is, and it's always been. At the end of the
Right.
day, what matters is where those parts end up. And the last thing we want them to do is end up on the landscape in a different location where the deer was harvested. Another thing to note here, as in companion to those regulations, is hunters will have to telecheck their deer in any county before it leaves that county of harvest, or by 10 p.m. on the day of harvest, whichever comes first. So that's a change that went into effect because of the carcass disposal.
Okay, so be sure to telecheck your deer before you move it.
That's right.
Or by 10 p.m.
Yes.
Which has always kind of been the case.
Yes.
And also we had some changes to the early youth portion, the bag limit of that. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so prior to this year, there was a 1 deer limit during the early youth portion of firearms deer season. This year, we removed that 1 deer bag limit. So the bag limit for the early youth portion is the same as the rest of the firearms portion. So it's consistent. It's much simpler. We don't have this one portion that has a unique bag limit. So beginning this fall, youth hunters can harvest more than 1 deer during the early youth portion. They have to, of course, abide by statewide and county level bag limits, and there's still a 1 antlered buck with a firearm bag limit. So that did not change, but this will certainly simplify the firearm deer season bag limit and also provide some more opportunity for young hunters as well.
Okay, good information to know. And also some regulations for this coming season. We've added some we've switched things up a little bit. So explain that.
Yeah, so we added a dozen counties to the management zone this year. These are either counties that had their first positive detection for CWD or counties that were within 10 miles of the first detection. And so just as a reminder, all the red circles that folks see were the new counties. All of the orange counties are counties that are in the management zone. So within those counties, folks are no longer able to put out feed or mineral for deer. Those counties are also open during the 5-day CWD portion of firearms deer season this fall.
Okay, good to know. Randy has a question. So as we see this next slide, those are the first slide is our management zone. This slide now is where we will be doing mandatory sampling. So tell us a bit more about that and why.
Yeah, so mandatory sampling allows us to collect a lot of CWD samples in a very short period of time. So we typically are getting samples from 20,000 deer in 2 days because it's the primary 2 days when folks want to be out deer hunting. So it allows us to be really efficient, to test a lot of deer for CWD and understand the distribution of that disease within those management zone counties so that we can detect the disease early and implement management to slow the spread. We don't have the resources to do mandatory sampling in all 82 counties of the zone, so we have to pick a subset of those, and we pick the ones that we feel are most beneficial in any given year to help us understand the distribution of CWD in those counties.
Okay. So some counties where we've been taking samples for a while, we have essentially enough sample. We're trying to reach new counties where the disease is newer to get more samples there.
Yeah, so if you look at the map in the middle, counties like Macon and Lynn or St. John and Jefferson, where we've done mandatory sampling for many, many years, we have a lot of samples because we've done mandatory sampling for many years. And so as we had to pick and choose which counties to do mandatory sampling in this fall, it's more advantageous for us to shift out of those counties where we have a lot of samples for this year so that we can sample some of the newer counties to the zone that we don't have as many samples from.
Okay, and that brings up a good point. Because Randy wants to know, St. Genevieve County is not a mandatory sampling county this year. So there will not be any test sites set up in that county because it's not a mandatory sampling county for that weekend.
So yeah, we will not have mandatory sampling in St. Genevieve County, but we do have sampling opportunities throughout the entire deer season for folks there. So between the freezer head drops that we have in the county, taxidermists and meat processors that collect samples for us, MDC offices, there's lots of sampling opportunities throughout the entire deer season for folks that want to have their deer tested, and we'd encourage them to do that. So lots of opportunities, but during mandatory sampling weekend, it will not be a requirement in St. Gen this year.
Okay, so Randy, I hope that information helps you. Again, you don't have to that weekend, but we always encourage you to have your deer sampled throughout the entire deer season. So thanks for that question. We also removed the antler point restriction in some counties. So this third slide, tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so the counties in orange are the ones that still have an antler point restriction this fall. The 9 red circles that you see were counties that had the APR last year, but not this year. The reason we removed the antler point restriction in those 9 counties is because all of those entered the CWD management zone. When a counties enter the management zone, we always recommend to the commission that we rescind the antler point restriction. because the antler point restriction protects yearling bucks from harvest, and those are the very segment of the population that disperse from the area where they were born. So if those deer are positive, they disperse from where they're born, sometimes going many, many miles. They could spread the disease. And so it doesn't make sense for us to have a regulation that would protect the very segment of the deer population that has the potential to spread the disease further.
Good to know. And as we're talking about the mandatory sampling county, John wants to know, and I don't want to put you on the spot, Rawls County is among, it's the first year for mandatory sampling there. Does that mean CWD has been found in Rawls County?
We have not detected CWD in Rawls County, but we did have our first detection in Marion County. And so since Rawls is within 10 miles of that positive detection, then that's what brought Rawls into the management zone and made it a candidate and was selected for mandatory sampling this fall.
Okay, thank you, Jason. And John, again, to clarify, for a county to be part of the mandatory sampling, it's either there was a CWD detection in that county or within 10 miles of that county border.
That's correct.
Okay, so hopefully, John, that answers that question for you. And then, as we're talking about this, deer health and disease, critical work for us. So let's talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, so we're going to get into a little more of the specifics of CWD, but just start at a high level and say that it's one of the greatest conservation challenges of our time, and certainly a very significant threat to our deer herd and our hunting culture. We first detected it in our wild herd back in 2012, and we've been working with hunters and landowners and other conservation partners to do the absolute best we can to slow the spread to protect our herd. You know, sometimes that involves developing regulations and management tools to slow the spread, and we recognize that, you know, in some cases those do impact our citizens, like we've already talked about. In the management zone, you can't put out feed or mineral for deer, and there are a lot of people that enjoy doing that. So we recognize that impact, and there are a lot of hunters that like the antler point restriction, but the APR goes away when a county enters the management zone. So we recognize the impacts to our stakeholders, but you know, if we look at the overall goal of maintaining that healthy deer herd, like we talked about early, those regulations and those management strategies, like targeted removal that happens at that localized level around positives to slow the spread, are really critical for us to have the ability to slow the spread of CWD and ensure the long-term sustainability and health of the herd.
Right, and these changes that we make, again, they're out of necessity. They're for the overall benefit of long-term deer health and overall consideration of our shareholders, our hunters, our landowners, things like that. So we're doing it for the reasons and ultimately to maintain a healthy herd. So there are a couple diseases happening right now that could appear to be similar. So one is EHD and the other one is CWD. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the differences in each of these?
Yeah, so two diseases found here in Missouri's deer herd, and sometimes folks get confused with the two. So hemorrhagic disease, you may have heard that referred to as EHD or blue tongue, a couple different viruses, and chronic wasting disease, which is a entirely different disease caused by a misfolded protein. And so we're going to walk through in these next few slides. We'll talk about hemorrhagic disease basics and what that means for the overall health of our deer herd. Then we'll transition to CWD, talk about CWD basics, and then what that means, what CWD potential effects are in the long-term health of our deer herd. So with hemorrhagic disease, or EHD, it's caused by a virus. This time of year, it's spread by biting midge flies. People often call them no-see-ums, or those tiny little ones.
Yes, those horrible little things.
Yeah. Most folks know them by no-see-ums. So this time of year, they'll spread this virus. They'll bite a deer that has the virus, and then when they bite another deer, they'll transmit the virus. And so usually with this virus, death within 1 to 2 weeks. So it's very quick and it's very synchronous. When I say synchronous, I mean it happens late summer, early fall. So all the mortality happens in a relatively short period of time.
In that one time of the season.
One time of the season, death within a week or two, and deer get a fever from the virus. They get internal hemorrhaging, so they're seeking water. So they're going to these ponds, creeks to drink, and that's exactly where the midges are breeding. So it's like, you know,
it worsens it.
It does worsen it. And so it's not 100% fatal. That is a key difference between CWD. And another important part is when we get the first frost of the fall and the midges die, the transmission cycle stops for the year.
Okay, and you said it's not 100% fatal, so some of the does then that survive can pass on those antibodies to EHD to their fawns
Yes.
while nursing.
Yes, they do. Yep. And that makes them more better able to fend off the virus in the future.
Okay, right. And as you said, with the first frost comes the end of EHD for that season, and it's not a threat to humans, but that's different when it comes to CWD as far as timing. So, and what happens with hemorrhagic disease as far as like kind of the deer populations? What's the big picture of those impacts?
Yeah. So we talked about the specifics of the virus. Most years we'll have a little bit of HD activity. We'll get a few reports. Some years we do have significant outbreaks. It can definitely have impacts on deer populations at a local level, and in some cases, when we have a big outbreak, can cause some pretty significant reductions in deer populations at a big scale. But we know very predictably after we have an HD outbreak, even a significant one, within a few years, the deer population rebounds and comes right back. So it can have short-term impacts, but is definitely not a long-term threat to our deer population.
Right, because I know back in 2012, we had that horrible, horrible drought where things were so dry, water was so limited, and then we had a big outbreak, I think in 2012, because of limited water, deer congregating at these. It was just, yeah.
Yeah, that was a bad one. Typically, we'll get some, often a typical year, maybe 100, 200 reports statewide. That year we had over 10,000.
Right.
So it was tremendous. But as significant as that outbreak was, fast forward a few years and deer numbers bounce right back.
Right.
So very, very predictable.
It's not a long-term threat. Compared, though, to chronic wasting disease. Am I going back? There we go.
CWD caused by a misfolded protein, so very different from hemorrhagic disease. Also, the way it's spread is different. So it's not being spread by a biting midgefly, it's being spread through direct deer-to-deer contact, or when deer contact the infectious proteins that have been left in the environment by an infected deer, can be transmitted if they come into contact with an infected carcass. We know does can also pass it on to fawns. So many challenges associated with this disease, one of which is that misfolded protein that causes the disease is really hard to degrade. And so once it gets in the environment, it can stay there for a period of years.
Good point, though. Ivan, we got your question. Ivan wants to know, so CWD is transmitted through these prions in the soil. How long can those persist in the soil?
So we know it can be years. Yep, we know they can be in the soil for years and remain infectious. And so that's one of the many challenges associated with the disease.
And even it's complicated in itself. We talk about these misfolded prions, and that's not really the easiest thing for folks to get their heads around. A virus is simple. Like if I simplify it, the deer with EHD die from a terrible like flu. It comes on fast, boom. Whereas a misfolded prion, can you simplify kind of how that works?
Yeah, so we all have normal prion proteins in our body.
So it's a protein.
Yeah, they're created by the body, then they're digested, created, digested,
Yeah.
and
hence normal.
Yeah, it's normal. The body builds them up, they break them down. But with CWD, you get one of those prion proteins that normally gets broken down, but it's misfolded so the body doesn't break it down. And then when it comes into contact with other normal protein that causes a chain reaction, it causes those to misfold, and then those cause others. And slowly through this chain reaction, they start to convert those normal prion proteins to misfolded one, and the body doesn't even recognize it as a threat. So it's slowly building up in the deer's body until it eventually kills the deer. And so when those deer come into contact with another deer, and those misfolded proteins come from one deer into the deer that doesn't have the disease, it starts that chain reaction in that deer, and that's eventually what will kill the deer.
Okay, and forgive me, this isn't exact science what I'm saying here. The EHD, again, kind of like a really bad flu that kills you quick. This sounds, again, but more of a cancer that kind of sneaks in and takes a lot longer. And what's it do ultimately kind of to the deer?
Yeah, so it's a lot longer period. So it from the time a deer gets CWD until when it starts to show clinical symptoms, or when we would say it starts to look sick, is 1.5 to 2 years. So it's a slow process. During that whole 1.5 to 2 year process, those misfolded proteins are causing others to misfold, and they're slowly accumulating in the spinal column, in the brain, and causing the death of brain cells. So as you're going through that 1.5 to 2 year period, those misfolded proteins are slowly causing that brain to degenerate until it gets to the point where it's severe enough that it starts to impact their behavior. They go downhill really quickly and then die.
Oh, this is where we're getting some good questions. So we are talking about the mineral restrictions in our mandatory sampling zones. Roger wants to know, does this apply to cattle farmers with neighbors putting out mineral blocks in their feed boxes? Some deer are visiting those. So does that include farmers?
It does not. No, we recognize that deer can come into contact those, but the restriction does not apply to normal agricultural practices.
Okay, so that caveat is out, yeah, not applicable to normal agricultural. Okay. And we also have someone, can they invite hunters to their property and then have those deer harvested and tested?
Yeah, absolutely. So we offer no cost testing throughout the entire deer season. There's lots of different opportunities, MDC offices, taxidermists, meat processors, freezer head drops. So yeah, absolutely. There's testing opportunities throughout the whole 4-month deer season.
All right, anything else here we want to cover? Again, it's 100% fatal.
It is 100% fatal,
HD.
so that's the difference between hemorrhagic disease and CWD. There's no known cure. There are researchers that are working on that, and no known human cases of CWD.
Okay, and HD too, that's not applicable to humans, so you can't catch HD from eating that deer.
That's correct.
Good to know. So again, as we talk about these effects, this is big picture long term when it comes to CWD.
It is, and so this is a very critical difference between hemorrhagic disease and CWD. CWD is a significant long-term threat to the herd and to our hunting culture. We know from other states that have had CWD for a long time that as the percentage of the herd that gets CWD increases, it significantly reduces survival of a higher percentage of the deer population and can lead to population declines. And so unlike hemorrhagic disease, which can cause significant mortality in the short term, they bounce right back in a predictable way. CWD is entirely different in that once it builds up in a population and cause that population to decline, we would not expect a population recovery.
So long term, if we don't do anything about it, we're looking at fewer deer and a younger kind of population of deer overall.
Yeah.
And that means fewer big bucks and
Yes.
mature does and all of that. So fewer and younger.
Fewer deer, and of the deer that are out there, they are younger.
So that is not good news. So here's a little bit of a graph. So comparing HD and CWD. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so this, I think for this graphic does a good job of talking about what we just described. If we look on the left under hemorrhagic disease, we see what you're looking at in that graph is just think of a stable deer population with that horizontal line, and we have an HD outbreak. It drops numbers, they bounce back. And the population persists for a while, we get a second HD outbreak, and then they bounce back.
Short, quick hits?
Short, quick hits, they come back. If we look at the one on the right,
not good.
It shows what happens to the population once you get enough individuals in a deer population that have CWD. It affects their survival so much that they're not replacing themselves through recruitment, and that population would decline significantly without any signs of, there's really no mechanism that would cause that population to bounce back.
Right, right. Charles wants to know, is there a vaccine in the works?
It's an active area of research. There are researchers at a number of universities that are working on a vaccine for CWD, but they are just not there yet, but it remains an active area of research.
Hope springs eternal. John wants to know too. So we know that deer can share CWD or transmit it through, shared scrapes, licking branches, close contact, and all of that. How do we know that it spreads, say, through mineral blocks on the ground? Is there significant data that confirms that or supports that?
Yep. So there's been a number of research projects that have looked at that. They've looked at the soil underneath mineral sites and have found prions in those locations. Not surprisingly, there's also been research that's looked at contact rates between deer at mineral sites, food plots, and agricultural fields, and have confirmed that you have a higher likelihood, more contacts at a mineral site, feed site, than you would in even a food plot or even a corn or a soybean field. So it definitely concentrates them more so than those other practices. We know deer are social animals. We know they're going to groom each other. We know they're going to work licking branches and make scrapes. We can't control any of that. Deer are going to be deer. But what we can control with regulations is that artificial congregation that we as humans can do, which is only going to make things worse.
Okay, and we get some comments from folks too that a mineral block, and you can't bait deer over a pile of corn. We know that. But they say, what's the difference between a mineral block or baiting in a food plot, a large food plot? And as I understand it, it's all in the concentration, right?
Yeah, so if you think about a food plot, deer, it obviously attracts deer. That's why people plant food plots. But the deer are foraging on the plants that are growing above, moving around more. They're not concentrated in that, 2, 3, 4 foot square area. And so they're spread out more. They're foraging on the forbs and grasses that are growing above the soil versus, for example, at a mineral site, they're licking the mineral, and then after the mineral's gone, they're even consuming the soil. They're very, very concentrated to a highly localized level. So there are some, in my mind, some pretty significant differences between the two in terms of their transmission risk of CWD.
All right, so Jason, we have a question again from Ivan, who has a neighbor claiming that they have a mineral product that prevents and reduces CWD. It's a miracle product, and they even have some flyers and things. Do we know of anything that reduces or prevents CWD in a food form like that?
No, we don't.
Okay, so don't trust your neighbor, Ivan. The science is not behind it. All right. So now we know that CWD affects deer populations. A lot of folks say, well, we don't keep the prevalence rate very low, so we're doing a good job of preventing it to be so apparent on the environment. Other states, not so much.
Yeah,
So some research that's going on there.
absolutely. Yeah, in Missouri right now, less than 1% of our samples are testing positive, and even in our core areas close to where we found the disease, less than 2% are testing
That's
positive.
great.
So we would not expect to see population declines because of CWD at that low prevalence.
Okay.
But if you go to other states where a third to even half the deer are testing positive, when you get that level of infection in a population, it's enough that it's significantly affecting the survival of enough deer that it can cause significant population declines. And so we've known that out west. You see the title from the article on the left there, from out west, of CWD causing population declines of whitetail deer. The one on the right there is a picture from a recent study that just wrapped up in Northwest Arkansas, where about half the deer test positive for CWD, and the results of that project have been very alarming. Significant declines in deer populations, low deer densities, and survival rates of those positive deer that are dramatically lower than deer that don't have the disease.
Okay, I'm coming back here. Missouri, we're about 1% generally prevalence rate, 3%, 2% in high concentration areas?
Less than 1% at the statewide scale, less than 2% even close to where we've detected the disease. The vast majority of our counties have less than 1% positive for the ones where we have found the disease. So very, very low levels of disease.
And am I hearing this right? Arkansas comparatively is at 50%?
Where they did this study in Northwest Arkansas, about half the deer are positive on their study areas.
That is a lot.
Yeah, so this table's from a study that was done in Southwest Wisconsin. They radio collared deer, they tested them for CWD, then they radio collared so that they could monitor them and follow their survival. And so if you look at all the radio collared deer that they had, of all the females that were not infected with CWD, 83% of those were surviving in any given year. So about what we would expect in a healthy deer. For all the deer that they collared, the females that were CWD positive, 41% of them survive a given year, so less than half. So huge impact on survival. For bucks, is even more staggering. So 69% of them were surviving in a given year if they did not have CWD. If they had CWD, 17% annual survival. So dramatic impacts on the survival rates.
Wow, those are pretty dramatic impacts. I think we missed one. So as we see, we talk about, we're doing pretty well here in Missouri. Wisconsin, again, not so much. Tell us about this poor guy.
So yeah, we don't, it's a question I get a lot. How come we don't see clinically sick deer with CWD in Missouri? We've already established that less than 1 in 100 tests positive has the disease in Missouri. So we have low levels of disease. We also know that it predisposes deer to other forms of mortality. So In Missouri, it's very rare to see a clinically sick deer like the ones that you see in these photos. Different story in different parts of the country. So these two trail camera photos are from a gentleman named Paul Lanier, hunts in southwest Wisconsin, where about a third of the deer in that county test positive in any given year. And so if you read this quote here, since 2019, 8 of the last 11 deer he shot on his family farm have tested positive. And on that family farm, which is not much bigger than 100 acres, he had 3 clinically sick deer like this farm last year. So he's seeing sick deer. Most of the deer he's shooting are positive, and he's another quote from Paul saying that of all the things that he's ever experienced in his life in terms of deer hunting, CWD has been the biggest turnoff to deer hunting that he's ever experienced. So you think about what it would be like to hunt in a place where you can't eat the majority of the deer, or most choose not to.
Right.
And you're seeing deer like this out there. What does that do to your motivation to want to continue to manage habitat and continue to want to deer hunt?
So you have family land, family farm, you have land, some people, specifically for deer hunting, and then this happens, and you can't even eat the deer that are on your farm because they're infected. We don't want to get there.
No.
It's easy enough to say. Okay, so we're getting into this graph. You're going to have to break it down for us a little bit because there's a lot going on.
Yeah, so a lot going on in this graph, but in my mind, this graph is a really good example of what actively managing and sustaining CWD management through time can do on a prevalence rate. And when I say prevalence rate, I just mean what percentage of the deer population has the disease. What percentage, when we say apparent prevalent, we mean what percentage of the samples test positive, but it's a proxy for prevalence, which is what percentage of the deer population would test positive. So here we've got Wisconsin, Alberta, Illinois, and a couple counties in Missouri, and we're going to walk through this graph and show the variation in management response to CWD and what that variation in management response did to apparent prevalence rates of CWD.
Okay.
So we're going to start, if we look at the left side of the graph there, year 1. So this is the first year that those jurisdictions identified CWD in their deer population. And first, we'll start at Wisconsin. So Wisconsin had a very aggressive CWD management approach. They were doing targeted removal close to where they found positives. They were managing the disease very aggressively. It became so controversial there that they were forced to stop managing CWD. You see that point on the graph there. And then you see at year 13, the dashed vertical line. By then, their prevalence rate had already increased to 11%.
Okay, so again, to clarify, Wisconsin, they started acting, but then they had to change and stop doing their targeted removals and things like that. Why? How did that happen?
Yeah, it just became so politically controversial in the state that the state agency was basically told that they could not manage the disease anymore.
And this wasn't from a scientific perspective.
No.
This is more from just a pressure, a social pressure.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it wasn't. It wasn't a decision of the agency.
All right, because again, they were doing the postseason targeted removal.
They were.
And they stopped.
They were, and then they stopped.
And
you can see the purple line in a matter of just a few years after they stopped their localized management. You see the trend of those prevalence rates rising rapidly.
Wow. So we're looking at the purple line here and how it is just shot up.
Yeah. So by 13 years after they detected the disease, 11% of their samples are testing positive. If we look at Alberta, they also managed the disease very aggressively the first 4 years after they had it, but then they stopped doing localized management as well. And so if we go out to year 13 for Alberta, we see that their prevalence rate, 7% of their samples were testing positive by year 13. And you can see that rapidly rising trajectory in prevalence rates. If we look at Illinois, they had a very aggressive management approach initially, and they sustained that through time. And so if you look at the dashed yellow line going all the way up to year 13, they were at about 3% of their samples testing positive. So much lower than Alberta, much lower than Wisconsin. And if we look at Missouri, if we look at Macon and Linn counties in north central Missouri, where we first detected the disease, we've had targeted removal that's happened since the very first year that we found it. We've sustained that effort through time. And in year 13, less than 2% of our samples are testing positive. So again, I think this figure does a really good job that shows 4 different jurisdictions. There's some similarities in their approach, but in terms of what that approach was and sustaining that through time, I think it's a very clear demonstration that with sustained aggressive management of CWD, we can keep CWD prevalence rates low.
Okay, before we get into public engagement, we have some questions related to our management of the disease. Now, controversy here is the postseason targeted removal that we talk about. And we have questions. Michael is saying, isn't this baiting? Aren't we essentially baiting? And then Roger is asking, is there any validity to sharpshooting groups in Missouri reducing deer numbers through targeted removal?
Yeah, so I'll address those. I'll start with the second one. There have been several peer-reviewed publications that have documented the success of targeted removal to keep prevalence rates low. So we know based on experiences here in Missouri and in other states and the peer-reviewed literature is a effective keeping prevalence rates low. The second part of that is referring to during targeted removal, which happens from mid-January to mid-March, we do allow some methods that we do not allow during regular deer season. One being we do allow the use of bait. And this confuses folks, and I certainly understand it because it's prohibited in the management zone, but yet we're doing it during target removal. And why the difference? The difference is during targeted removal, our objectives are to remove additional positives off the landscape and to lower deer densities in those localized areas. And to do that, we have to do it efficiently. And so we bait on a limited period of time, which allows us to remove our target number of deer really quickly, and then the baiting at that site stops. So unlike allowing everybody to put out feed 365 days a year, targeted removal uses it in a very limited time frame. We put the bait out. Once the removal number is met, the bait goes away. And so it allows us to remove more deer. And I would honestly say if we did not have the ability to use bait, we would remove dramatically fewer deer, and that would not be in the best interest of the herd in the long term, because by removing fewer deer, we're not slowing the disease as much as we could with using that tool.
Right. If we look at, say, last year's numbers, how many new cases of CWD overall did we detect last year?
243.
243. And how many of those were detected through our targeted removal?
During target removal, it's almost 30%.
So about a third of our detections come through this targeted removal. And I want to emphasize too, when we talk targeted removal, it's deer management. It's not deer hunting, because you are not allowed to put bait out or things like that for deer hunting. This is not deer hunting. This is deer management, a different practice. Whereas, yes, we use sharpshooters, we use MDC staff, we use the landowners who can remove deer for this purpose, right?
Yes, that's a good way to frame it, and that's exactly right. It is not deer hunting. It is a disease management tool. And so the two
entirely different, really.
Entirely different. And that's why the methods that we can use during targeted removal, for example, differ from what's during the regular season. But to your point, the number I threw out there of almost a third, if we look at all the samples that we get in any given year from hunter surveillance versus the ones that we get from target removal, a higher percentage of those deer that we remove during target removal are positive than we are through our general samples. And that's because we are strategically going into those areas within a mile or two of positives. And so for the number of deer that are removed in those areas, they represent a disproportionately high percentage of the positives that get removed off the landscape.
Right. And to clarify for folks, because we know there's misinformation out there, we work voluntarily with landowners. So we approach landowners and ask if we could do this on their land. Okay. We also let them participate if they want as part of this, or we have our staff that do this targeted removal.
Yeah, so the landowners in these core areas, when we ask if they want to participate in target removal, they can certainly say no. It's their prerogative to do so. If they want to participate, they can either allow MDC staff to do their removals, or they can receive an authorization from us that would allow them or anybody that they choose to do their removals as well.
Okay, so in all the deer that we remove through these post-season targeted removals, we have all those deer tested, and any deer that come back negative with CWD, the landowner can have those deer, or they can choose to donate them to our Share the Harvest program.
That's right. Yep. So all the deer that don't test positive get utilized.
Okay. So to reiterate, postseason targeted removal isn't deer hunting. It is disease management for very specific purposes. And then we have people saying that by doing this, we're slaughtering the deer herd. Can we get a little perspective here? So I'm going to ask you some numbers. So last season, our postseason targeted removal, how many deer did we remove?
About 4,700.
About 4,700. Okay, now that compares to hunters last year. How many deer did they harvest during the regular hunting season?
About 275,000.
So 4,700, 275,000. And then how many deer do we estimate in Missouri?
About 1.7 million.
So that 4,600 really isn't a slaughter. It is careful removal, targeted removal, exactly what it is, right?
Yeah, and it only occurs on less than 5% of Missouri's landscape. And
Right.
even within those areas where targeted removal occurs, during the average deer hunting season, hunters are removing more deer during the hunting season in those core areas than with targeted removal. So even in those highly localized areas, hunters are still removing more deer than targeted removal does.
Right. And somebody asked what qualifies as a sharpshooter. We don't need a sharpshooter qualification for this. It's hunters removing deer, correct?
For targeted removal.
Yes.
So the landowners can get the authorization to do it themselves. For MDC staff, they are
Okay.
trained. They have to go through a course. And so there is a process that we have in our training to make sure that they're trained to
So they're very
fulfill that duty.
effective
Yes.
in succeeding
Yes.
when shooting deer. Yes. Good to know. Okay. Ian wants to know. So if a county is determined to be positive because there was a positive in that, at what point can they be removed from that list? Is there a time frame, or how does that work?
So we have had a case in the past where we had one positive where we did removals for 3 years, did not detect any additional positive, and we moved counties from the zone. But unfortunately, it seems like the pattern that we see is when we have a positive in an area that brings a county in the zone, usually in most cases, it's not going to be the only positive during a 3-year period within there. So there have been exceptions to that, but by and large, when a county enters a zone, it stays in the zone.
So it's possible, but not probable. And that's unfortunate because of just the nature of the disease and the expansion. Even though we're keeping the prevalence rate very low, it's still expanding, which that happens.
It is, yeah. So the disease is definitely spreading geographically.
It's not just here, it's really everywhere.
And we would expect that, but the encouraging part is, as we've talked about, the low prevalence rates and the fact that just a small percentage of our population has a disease, and that's what we're trying to keep.
That's where we want to keep it. Okay. And again, a big part of this is public education, public cooperation, public engagement in our partnerships. So tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned when I started the slideshow, our partnership between the agency and stakeholders goes all the way back to the formation of our agency. It's equal to restoring the population and to managing the population to where we are today. And so certainly, if you think about that partnership, the lion's share of Missouri's landscape is under private ownership. So our private landowners are managing the habitat. They are the primary tool that keeps deer numbers at desired levels. They are submitting samples for CWD testing. They are participating in CWD management. So many different ways that partnership is that joint effort between us and the involvement of our stakeholders.
We can't do it without our partners.
We can't do it without our partners. We also have scientific collaborators. We do a lot of research here in Missouri and with collaborators throughout the country. So they're critical partners as well. And we often, we always emphasize the importance of two-way communication. So it's important for us to do a good job of providing information about deer and deer management to our stakeholders, but we need to hear from them. We want to hear from them. And this dovetails right into the last few slides that we'll cover, which talk about our effort to the public this fall about deer management, hear what they have to say.
Okay, do we know, who wants to know? Michael is asking, of the deer were removed through the postseason targeted removal, do we know how many were does, and do we know if those does were pregnant? And does that have an impact? Again, we're talking numbers here.
Yeah, so most of the deer that are removed during targeted removal are antlerless deer, and the vast majority of our adult and yearling does breed every year.
Right. So time of the year, yes.
Yeah, whether they would have been removed in February or whether they've been removed in November during the hunting season, December, they would be, obviously they're pregnant in both those cases. The primary peak of breeding is in early to mid-November.
Right. So we would expect the majority of them to be pregnant.
And most of them, yes.
Yeah, that also shows a healthy deer herd.
Yes.
And again, the 4,600 deer that were removed through targeted removal last year, not going to have a huge impact or any impact on the overall population of the 1.7 million deer in the state.
No.
Okay. So as we look at this, two-way communication is critical, especially in times like this, and we're doing that. We have some stuff coming up.
Yeah, so we've got a series of 10 deer management open houses that kick off tomorrow night in St. Joe, and those will wrap up on October 16th. So we've got at least one in each MDC region of the state, so hopefully close enough where most folks that want to go can attend one. if they can't make it to the open house, or if they can, there's also the online comment opportunity. So I've got the link there on the screen. So if folks want to hop on that link, they can provide their input about deer management. And so that period will end on October 16th. So we still got plenty of time for folks to provide their input, whether they want to go to the open houses and visit with staff, or whether they want to go on our website and provide comment that way.
Right, and it's so easy. You don't even have to remember this. If you just go to our website at mdc.mo.gov and look at our homepage, and we'll have some information up there. And we just shared that link with you also. So we have these open houses coming up around the state. So as we can see, the 4 across the top part, and then 3 across the middle and 3 across the bottom. And that other flyer is a list of specific locations.
Yeah, so these are come and go as you please, anytime from 4 to 8. There's no presentation that's
Stop on in
anytime between 4 and 8. There's no registration required. We'll have half a dozen stations set up. Those will cover everything from deer seasons and regulations, CWD and EHD, managing your property for whitetails, our deer management assistance program, our 10-year deer management plan revision. So it's an opportunity to get information from us, but also an opportunity for the public to let us know how they feel about deer management.
Right. So we encourage you, join our open houses. It's really about everything deer and deer management.
Yes.
Right. So we encourage you to attend these. If you can't, stop on in on those dates anytime between 4 and 8 p.m. And if you can't make those, we have online information also and comment that way. And why are we doing this? What do we want to take from it?
Yeah, so it provides an opportunity for us to share information with the public. We'll have some handouts. Really an opportunity also for us to get input from the public of how they feel about our deer population, deer seasons and regulations, how we communicate with the public about deer management, and how folks feel about our CWD management efforts. So there'll be a couple flyers there that folks can fill out while they're there and submit those.
So they can share their comments at the meetings also.
That way.
Online.
And so, yeah, just an opportunity for a lot of good one-on-one conversations. And we look forward to that opportunity. And between the comments that we get on the online period and what we get at the open houses, we'll have a really good idea of how our folks feel about how we're managing the resource, and certainly we'll use that information to help influence future decision making.
Thank you, Jason. What an amazing amount of information. So again, folks, we were here today with Jason Isabel with the Missouri Department of Conservation talking deer management. And again, we want to emphasize that we have some community open houses coming up throughout the state, and we also have an online comment opportunity through October 17th. So Jason, thank you for being here tonight. What an amazing amount of information.
Yeah, I enjoyed it, and I appreciate everybody for joining tonight.
And thank you all for joining us here, and we hope to see you at our upcoming open houses, or at least hear from you in our online comments. So thanks for joining us on this Missouri Department of Conservation Wild Webcast. We have recorded it, and we will post it in the coming days. That's it, folks. Thanks. Get outside and discover nature.